Hey, Peters. We are on 4.1, Part 1, Transoceanic Voyages in the Early Modern Era. Let's get started right away. Our first word is the astrolabe. The astrolabe, this thing is pretty awesome. The astrolabe is used for all different kinds of mathematics. You can actually tell the time by looking at the stars and by moving some things around on it, which is very cool. You can also find out, more importantly, where you are on the earth, directions where you're moving, how to get from one place to another using the stars. This was first made by the Greeks all the way back to the classical era. Then, in the post-classical era, the Muslims began to use the astrolabe first to get where they were going in the desert in their huge area, Dar al-Islam, Arabia, for example, a large desert area, parts of Africa as well. And it was also used for the sea to be able to tell what direction you were going. Without the astrolabe, the Europeans before this, for example, they would not try to travel outside of land because they were afraid that if they did that, they wouldn't be able to get back, which is, again, think way back in ancient times, if you're out in sea and all you can see is water, it's hard to know where you're going. But you can use the stars. And that's what the astrolabe allowed you to do. So the Muslims were very good at using it. And then it gets into hands of the Portuguese at first. And why is that? Because with Dar al-Islam, which spread during the post-classical era and was still very big and powerful in the early modern era, the Portuguese get this and begin using it. It diffused, like much technology, diffused to the Arabian Peninsula here with Spain and Portugal, and they got this technology and they were able to use it on their transatlantic voyages across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. That is the astrolabe, an incredible piece of technology that allowed you to travel by using the stars. The Portuguese get it, very historically significant because it will have to do with a lot of their travels, which will allow them to go around Africa all the way to, it's a little too much of a zoom in, all the way around Africa to India, across the ocean, and this will begin the European age of exploration in the early modern era, which plays a huge impact in the world as the Europeans get to America, South America, disease spreads. They're able to take a lot of the land and resources, establish trade with China, and we see Europe rise in this early modern period. So that is what the astrolabe is allowed to do. The Portuguese create the mariner's astrolabe, which is a little more of a simpler version of the astrolabe, which is just basically for traveling on the sea during their age of exploration to make their transatlantic voyages. Again, this is significant because it allows the Portuguese and then the Spanish and then other European powers like England and France to start traveling more around the world. Europe starts exploring the world. And in our next era, when we get to the modern period, we will see European domination, which does begin with the age of exploration in the early modern period. Okay, cartography. Many advances were made in cartography. One way to see this is look at what the Europeans were using before they had their advances. The TO map. A TO map was made because of its shape, which looks like an O and a T. It was a map that put Jerusalem in the center of the earth and then divided the land between Noah's sons, and was a map based on using the Bible. It wasn't a very good map. The Bible shouldn't be used as a map. That's ridiculous. Basically, this is a symbol and shows why the Europeans weren't able to do much exploring before they started getting their technology and goods, mostly from the Muslim world. The significance of this is technology like this and basing your exploration on the Bible isn't a good idea. And it's a symbolism of how Europe in the Middle Ages, in the post-classical era, was kind of stuck where they were because they weren't making advances of science, because they weren't looking at science as a science. They were basically trying to put science and religion together, which is not a good idea. They don't have to be together. Religion's about faith. It's about what you believe. Science is about exploration. So The TL map is a pretty good symbol of why Europeans were not able to make advances. That is the historical significance. Once Europeans start getting the astrolabe, cartography advances that they get from the Muslim world and Jewish people living in Spain or other areas, we start seeing a lot of advances for the Europeans that will happen in the early modern period. Ptolemy was an ancient Greek writer, cartographer, means map maker, and astronomer. In Europe in the post-classical era, in Western Europe in the post-classical era, they weren't reading Ptolemy anymore. They weren't reading much of the Greek classical works. Now, what happened after the Crusades, when the Europeans start getting more contact with the Muslim world and have increased contact with the Byzantine Empire, what we see is they get a translation of Ptolemy and they start advancing his work in map making, which allows them to advance their cartography and start making better maps, which will allow the Europeans to explore more and see more of the world that'll be out there. And again, this starts with Portugal and Spain, not a coincidence since they were very close and used to be in part of the Islamic world. And these advances start happening, which allow Europe to start making improvements in other areas and advance in their exploration. Lisbon, which is the capital of Portugal, was a major city for cartographers who met and were making new maps, and was a major center for exploration in the early modern era. We see Lisbon right here, very close to Africa, very close to Dar al-Islam. Used to be part of it until the Reconquista came, and the Christians in Portugal and Spain were able to defeat the Muslims and to take their land in Spain and Portugal. Lisbon becomes a map-making center, also becomes a center for ship-making and design, which leads to more exploration happening, and eventually will lead to more exploration like we see on this map, where the Europeans start exploring more of the world, getting out there eventually to the Americas, to Africa, to India, and increases their trade, much of it forcibly, and Europe will become a more dominant player in the world in the early modern era. Let's take a look at our next one, which is the caravel. A caravel is a fast and removable ship which was devised by the Portuguese, as it says here, and was able to carry more than other ships before them. So the caravel was a ship that the Portuguese are able to use. It can move pretty fast. Now, the caravel is significant because it allows more traveling, it allows it to go quicker, they can take more goods, but it really adapted the lantine sail that we see here. So the lantine sail, which is our next word. And that was first, again, started by Arab merchants. And the lantine sail we see here are sails that can move, so you can go kind of like with the wind, against the wind. It gives you more options of moving despite what the wind is. And basically the Europeans are able, with the caravel, to use the lantine sail on it to advance their ships. And then after the caravel, they're able to get this huge, huge ship called the galleon. And the galleon is a multi-deck ship, which just means there's more decks. We see down here more levels of it pretty much. And this is able to, for Spanish treasure fleets pretty much, as they go out to many other parts of the world, as we see in the Age of Exploration, as we see them go out to the Caribbean, they go to Africa and India, and they are able to make many advances because of the galleon and increase their trade. Sadly, the galleon is also used for the Middle Passage, and that is going to be our next word. The Middle Passage is one of the darkest terms for us to be learning about in history. The Middle Passage was part of what's called the triangular trade, because it looks kind of like a triangle here. We see trade from Africa to the Americas to Europe, back to Africa. Today we refer to this in AP as the Atlantic System. The triangular trade and Atlantic System are pretty much the same thing. The Middle Passage was the part of the trade route where slaves were taken from Africa. They were bought with many manufactured goods that came from Europe, started by the Spanish and the Portuguese, where they would come and they would bring the goods over here. They would trade them for slaves. Now, most of the slaves that were kidnapped were actually kidnapped by Africans. Why would this be done? It was done because when the Europeans came, they would go to one tribe and have them kidnap people from another tribe for the manufactured goods, And this would allow that cultural group in Africa to gain more goods and use them against their neighbors. Also in Africa, land wasn't really owned. It wasn't privately owned. Land was held by many people, and there was slavery in Africa. However, when the slaves were traded to the Europeans, slavery was much different. The Africans who were trading slaves to the Europeans didn't think they were trading these people, that their sons and their daughters and their future generations would become slaves. Slave wasn't like a multi-generational thing, slavery. And most slaves in Africa, they weren't slaves because of skin color. They were slaves because they were either in debt, they had perhaps lost a war. What happens is, as Europe starts bringing in more and more goods, more and more weapons, there are some groups in Africa who start capturing more slaves and selling them to the Europeans because they realize, hey, this is a way that we can make money and we can gain more power. Kidnap our neighbors, sell them to the Europeans, our rival groups who are around us. We'll get more weapons, we'll advance, and we'll be able to fight against our neighbors. The Middle Passage part, to bring us back here, is the route that African slaves took to the Americas. Very important to note that 70% of the Africans who were kidnapped into slavery end up either in Brazil or the Caribbean region. That is where the majority go. There are some who go to the United States. There are some who go to Mexico. But all over the Americas, and this is what we would call the African diaspora, where African people are spread all over the Americas as they come from Africa. And that is why there's a very large African population in Brazil, African ancestry, Haiti, Caribbean, and the Americas as well. And the part that they went on of this Atlantic system was called the Middle Passage. It could take 40 days. It could take up to 2 months in a boat, chained down on a ship, as they were fed and then brought to the Americas, many dying, no place to go to the bathroom. You can imagine how horrible it would be to be in this Middle Passage, one of the horrible, worst areas of world history that we learn about. The Volta Dumar was pretty much winds that were used to increase sailing. They were discovered by the Portuguese, and they realized that if they took winds one way and then took them back on their sails, it wasn't necessarily the shortest way to travel, but it was a way you could travel with the wind and was much easier for traveling. So Europeans like the Spanish and Portuguese first discovered this. As they increased their transoceanic, transatlantic trade and exploration, they started discovering more of these winds, which were a very good way to travel back. And if you followed the wind, it just became much easier. I'm just showing you several different ways this worked. So as they would go off, they would use the winds to get the best possible traveling, whether it was to the Americas or even around Africa. And the Volta Dumar, once this was discovered and used, was very significant because it made traveling easier for the Portuguese and Spanish and other Europeans like the French and the English as they traveled the world to the Americas and many other places.